Hey, so one thing I really want to discuss right now is think about the deep state, or what some people call the shadow government. There's so many different words for it. How do you think this occurred, or what do you think fueled this separation of the military-industrial complex and the government, where, presidents, for example, like Jimmy Carter, in your experience with that, asking for information, getting denied? How did the slippery slope become as bad as it is now?
The key to this was that right at the end of World War II, that in the final months of World War II, before the German surrender in Europe, the head of the anti-communist and anti-Eastern Bloc intelligence for the Third Reich, General Reinhard Gehlen, his name was, he microfilmed all of the files of the Third Reich, identifying all of the spies that the fascists had in place all around Europe and all of the suspected communists that were around. And he microfilmed them, and he and like 14 of his other friends that were in his division fled Germany. And they fled up into the mountains in Bavaria, and they buried these big barrels that had the microfiche in them. And then when the surrender took place of Germany, he put on a uniform of an American private and went down and turned himself in to the 101st Counterintelligence Corps of the United States Army, and said, "I am Reinhard Gehlen. I am the commander of the Third Reich's anti-communist operations, and you're going to need me, because now that the war is over, you're going to have to deal with Russia and the Soviet Union." And it made this big kind of anti-communist kind of rap to them. And he said, and so I will volunteer to work with you if you will have me. And so he ended up being assigned a translator, a man by the name of Theodore G. Shackley, who was a young lieutenant in the 101st Counterintelligence Corps, German-American, spoke German and Polish and was a translator. He got assigned to him. And the two of them carried on a negotiation with the 101st Counterintelligence Corps, and actually had Gehlen, come all the way to the United States, and went to a place called Fort Hunt outside of Washington, D.C., and they spent 3 weeks there negotiating with, they didn't have any Central Intelligence Agency, they had the OSS, the Office of Special Services, and other State Department people, and they carried out this negotiation at Fort Hunt, and they struck an agreement that Reinhard Gehlen, General Reinhard Gehlen, would be made the deputy director of the new West German intelligence in Germany, okay? And he would end up utilizing his people, his 100 men. He wanted 100 men taken off the Nuremberg War Tribunal lists for the German military, and that he'd be allowed to take them off the list and keep them as his organization. They call it the Gehlen Org. And he based them in Berlin, and his guys were all Nazis, ran the anti-communist intelligence for the Western nations for 26 years. And they set up an academy up in Bavaria at a place called Oberammergau. It was the Anti-Communist Special Warfare Training Academy, and they had people from all of the Western allies, the U.S., Britain, France, Canada, Israel, all of them, that they sent young men to this academy up in Bavaria, up in Oberammergau. And between 1948 and 1965, they trained 1,200 men, okay? And they spread out into all of the national security departments of all of the Western powers. And what happened is, in the United States, they and a group of people, particularly from Brown Brothers Harriman, a big private investment company, the legal counsel for whom was Allen Dulles, and one of their senior partners, a man by the name of Robert LaFerret, I'm trying to think of his name. But anyway, these guys drafted up a proposal to the Truman administration, proposing that they set up a Central Intelligence Agency, and that the Central Intelligence Agency was a special organization that was designed to root out and to destroy the communists, saying that they were attempting to take over the world. And what they were doing is the socialists well, by that time Stalin had come to power, and so they'd really transformed from simply a world socialist, anti-capitalist organizing group around the world into a major nationalist security force in the Soviet Union. And so that they ended up establishing this dialectic between the two of them, and that our people, our side, if you will, the Western powers, had these 1,200 men that were spread out through all of the countries. They all recommended setting up agencies similar to the CIA, and they had like the Mossad were in Israel, and they had the MI3 or MI5 was over in England. They had the in France. They had a what was the name of it? There was another group like that in France. These are hardcore right-wing people, and when they were trained at the academy, they were trained by a guy by the name of General Otto Skorzeny. Otto Skorzeny was in fact the commandant of the SS Special Forces in the SS, and he trained the people at the academy, and he trained them in fascist ideology that was straight Third Reich, anti-communist, pro-fascist alliance. Fascism is not exactly the same thing as authoritarianism. Fascism is the giving over of the instrumentalities of the government to support corporations.
So you'd say we're pretty...
That's what that is. Well, that is what that is. Mussolini wrote the tract on fascism, what that is. And that is what it is. It's the alliance between the instrumentalities of the state and the capitalist corporations. Okay, and so that's what was trained at the academy. So you have, as of the National Security Act of 1947, you have created the Central Intelligence Agency. The lawyer for Brown Brothers Harriman, who are the people who helped draft the legislation for the thing, this guy Allen Dulles became the first civilian head of the CIA. Okay, and so that they made war all around the world against not just Russians or Soviet Union agents, but all communists and all socialists and all progressives. You know, they were totally pro-capitalist. They were really fascists that were organizing for capitalists to maintain control over the natural resources of these places around the world for the corporations. So the corporations could take the raw materials and put them through their corporate structures and make profits for their stockholders. It's simple rules that they had, and so that's how it got started. And so what they did is, in addition to setting up the Central Intelligence Agency, they set up inside the White House a National Security Council that had the President, Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, and then later the NSA, the National Security Agency, then later the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, then DISC, the Defense Industrial Security Command. They began setting up all of these alphabet organizations inside the national security state bureaucracy. And they basically said the United States had to conduct ourselves like a national security state in order to engage in this continuing war against communism around the world. And under the rubric of being anti-communist, they basically promoted and fostered all the interests of the private corporations. You know, overthrowing Latin American countries, you know, putting total fascists that had fled from Europe, actually facilitated the flight of the fascists from Europe. They worked with the Vatican under Pope Pius XII and his Secretary of State, Cardinal Vio. You know, actually facilitated transporting Nazi commanders and officers out of Europe and hid them out in Argentina and Uruguay and Brazil and in Bolivia, and then they rose into power in the militaries. Okay, that's probably a lot more information than you ever wanted, but the bottom line is that's how the national security state bureaucracy got established here. And so that in 1947, when Roswell occurred, and they discovered, oh, lo and behold, look, we've got this high-tech equipment in this vehicle that crashed here, we can use this for the Cold War. We can get access to this technology, keep the Russians from getting it. We'll have it. We can make weapons out of it. And so what they did is they declared all the information about UFOs and ETs to be national security state information, so that they stayed on top of trying to get that technology to use in the Cold War throughout that entire period from 1947 all the way up to 1991 December, during the period of the Cold War. So that's how it happened, and so that they just perceived this whole issue as something that would automatically fall under the aegis of the national security state, because that's how they looked at things. That's how they perceived things, and we were spending half and then more than half of all of our annual budget every year on the military. Okay, and then the national security state became so powerful and so effective that what they did is they had not only this huge, massive military budget, but they had this black budget. That doubled it.
That brings, actually one of my questions I wanted to talk about was was it 23 trillion that was missing from the Pentagon? Where do you think they're actually getting these funds from, and what do you think they're doing with this money specifically? And how do you think they can keep going without being accountable? How are they not being forced to be accountable for that? That's a large amount of money to go missing.
Some of the money for the national security state comes from a major trove of gold that was the Japanese General Yakushima actually headed up a thing from 1935 all the way through to 1940. Prior to the U.S. coming into the war in 1941, the Japanese Imperial Army marched all through Asia, and under this group that was called the Golden Lily. That was the Japanese name for it, the code name of the Japanese Lily, the Golden Lily group. And they went all through Asia, robbing and pillaging and taking gold and silver and platinum, jewels of all kinds, and commandeering them throughout all Asia for that entire period from 1935 to 1940, 5 years. And they stored all that gold and stuff in Japan. And when the Germans surrendered in 45, early in was it March? I think March of 45. The bottom line is Japan was still at war with the U.S. and the U.S. started mobilizing to prepare to invade Japan. And Japan knew that they were going to invade them, and so what they did is they started smuggling all this gold by submarines out of Japan and burying it in the Philippines. And they had 175 troves of treasure. Each treasure trove worth $100 billion. Wow. And there were 176 of them. And that was $100 billion, each one of them, in 1945. The prices for gold, $32 an ounce. It's now $1,200 and some dollars an ounce. So that these treasure troves were buried in the Philippines, and at the end of World War II, the United States dropped the bombs on them, so they didn't invade them. But when they disbanded the OSS that I'd mentioned earlier, the Office of Special Services, there was one guy that was he was a major, I believe, in the United States Army. Remember what his name was. But anyway, he was put in charge of G2 in the Philippines. And what's his name? I'll think of it in a minute. But the bottom line is, when General Yakushima got arrested, they arrested his driver as well. And this fellow brought him into custody, the driver, and they tortured him to try to find out where these treasure troves were buried. And he told them where 100 or 10 of them were. 10 or 12 of them, I think they were. And they tortured him, and they dug one of them up to prove that they were there. And this guy, what is his name? Colonel. I'll think of the guy's name. But anyway, he flies over to Singapore, where Douglas MacArthur, who was the commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific, was there, and tells him about this treasure trove that they found here, right? And so the general sends his G2 along with this fellow all the way to Washington, D.C. to tell Truman that they've got this money. And Truman brings into his office for this meeting two deputy the Secretary of Army, Stilwell, and two of his deputies, both of whom were senior partners in Brown Brothers Harriman that I told you about. And they come in and they set up a private trust. They did not turn the money over to the United States government at all. They put it into a private trust, and they put it in the International Credit Bank in Geneva, Switzerland. And they set up a whole private account, and they issued gold certificates through these banks, which they used to elect fascists all through Europe, to keep socialists from being able to get elected. That's called the Truman Doctrine, of saying that we cannot allow socialists or communists to be elected, even if it's the will of the people in Europe. And so that they made it a point not to allow them in, and they actually had fascists elected as town mayors and governors and presidents and stuff in all these countries using this money, and it became a black fund. It became a black fund that they had of multiple $trillion, $1.2 trillion they had, and that they used it for, and so it established this doctrine of black money. They called it the Black Eagle Trust. It was what they called it. It was the code name for it. And they had all this money, and they used it for anti-communist activities around the world. So they had this doctrine of this black money and the black budget. And so that then when they discovered this issue of this extraordinary secret of the existence of an extraterrestrial civilization at Roswell in July of 1947, they Landell is the guy's name, Colonel James Landell, I think, Langell. Anyway, the bottom line is that the raising of money for the black budget over and above the Black Eagle Trust that they had, that all they have to do is print up the money. All they have to do is print it up. And it's not money that's put into the general circulation, because if they were put into general circulation, it would inflate you'd have inflation and it would depreciate the value of the money. But what they did is they had it in a complete black budget, where they would give the money, for example, to Raytheon or to the Skunk Works or to other places, and so that they could print the money. And that's how they have all that money.
So one thing I want to mention, as a human rights activist as you are, a lot of people believe in or subscribe to universal law of free will, or that's an important thing to a lot of people, is free will, that people like to feel that they have that. Do you feel that we even have free will when there is so much modification of our foods? There's things that we don't like with vaccines, I don't even know, but we don't really know what's going on with that. Sound warfare, and how certain sound frequencies can alter our brain chemicals. There's just all these different things. Do you think we even chemtrails, like, do we have free will anymore?
The question is whether we ever did. You know, you have to be careful about that, because you take a person that has no insight whatsoever into their astrological predilections. They have no insight into their DNA, a kind of general programming that they have that's just strictly biological. They have virtually no insight into the degree to which they've been programmed by their culture to believe certain culturally unique things, and they think that the decisions they're making are all their own. So to begin with, right away, probably, less than 10% of what a person really decides to do is really their own free will at all. And so it reminds me of there's an old Irish aphorism that the Irish call Ireland the old sod, is the nickname they have for it. And the old aphorism is, the old sod, it's not what it used to be, but then it never was. So you got to understand is that all of this stuff about, they're attacking my free will, most of the time people don't even begin to exercise free will. You have to be fairly disciplined. you have to do meditation, you have to rise above the kind of cultural training, the astrological predilections that you got, the DNA type of predilections that you got that you aren't aware of at all. I mean, when you can sit down with an astrologer and they'll sit there and they'll tell you what your boyfriend is like, and what kind of food you like, and what kind of job you have, and what your attitude is toward your parents, and you're sitting here just completely thunderstruck about, wait a second, I that was all my own free will. I made all those choices myself. So you got to start with that. Now, with regard to the rest of it, again, you have to be careful of extrapolating beyond what the evidence tends to support. And a lot of the folks in this realm, because they legitimately distrust the government, they legitimately distrust the national security state elements, they legitimately distrust both political parties, okay? And they know that their Central Intelligence Agency exists, which is intentionally duplicitous and manipulative. And they know that the Central Intelligence Agency has a whole program called MK Ultra, where they are intentionally attempting to manipulate people. They have a whole thing with neuro-linguistic programming. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Yeah, so they have all kinds of these devices that they intentionally deploy to try to manipulate people and get people to do things unwittingly. That's all true. But the fact of the matter is 99% of the people who think that they're being brainwashed or manipulated or that kind of stuff are not, because they're not anybody. I mean, they're not doing anything. They're not, who cares what they're doing, really? They're not doing anything to interfere with the government. They don't even know what the government's doing. It usually arises from some kind of an individual neurosis or anxiety or desire to be, have celebrity or something like that. But usually they've usually, you'll find, gone through some kind of a traumatic experience, that their parents have died, their mother has died, or they've broken up with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and they're in a very vulnerable state, and they start having some kind of, and plus with all the kind of weird drugs and stuff that doctors are prescribing to people. A person has kind of minor anxiety over some kind of trauma in their life, and they go to see a doctor, and they give them some kind of weird pills, and the commercials, the commercials go on for 3 minutes about what the side effects are, and then what happens is, because of the distrust in the government and the general knowledge that's afloat now in the culture about these covert programs that they're all doing, they automatically start associating that. And they start thinking, oh, I must have been targeted by some secret MK Ultra project. And you say, the first thing, I've talked to dozens of people, and so I start talking with them about, like, let me ask you some questions about whether there would be any reason why anybody would be doing that.
But I guess on the mass scale, do you see any evidence for trying to intentionally lower people's consciousness or state of awareness through different means on a mass population scale? Have you come across anything?
Well, we do know that the Reagan-Bush administration had very specific conversations about cutting off federal funding for education for working class kids and stuff like that, saying that this didn't work out well at all. To give scholarships to working class kids and try to facilitate people from the lower classes and working classes coming up into the educated class, because they all turned on the establishment. All through the 1960s, said, well, that didn't work. And so that they consciously programmed cutting off all the funds and making colleges extremely expensive, so just the elite would be able to send their kids to college. That's all true. That's been established. We know what those documents are and all of that. Now, there are other more dangerous programs that I know about, but they do have some of them that were designed to be deployed against large populations. That is true. that they did some of that in the remote viewing program. There was
Operation Stargate?
no, they took some of the people that were in the remote viewing program, Pat Price, Ingo Swann, some of the others, and that they actually brought them to a facility where, after they'd learned to do this remote viewing, this projecting of their consciousness at a distance and stuff, they brought them to a facility in southern Canada, actually. And, you know, I'm reluctant to even talk about this because people then get carried away about it and go, oh, that must be what they're doing. But the bottom line is they had this facility where they actually put this helmet on Pat Price and had him intentionally kind of broadcasting this thought. And they had this big, huge dish on the top of the building, and they had it pointed down toward the northern peninsula of Michigan. And they had him just over and over saying you should file your next year's federal income tax forms in this little post office box down in West Virginia. And 85% of all the people did it.
Wow, fascinating. What's the name of this?
That's true.
What is the name of this?
That was a subdivision of the remote viewing program, the Stanford Research Institute, SRI, under Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. I did that with Pat Price and Ingo Swann. And I talked with Ingo about that and read the documents that he had on it and he showed me. So I know that that's true. Now that's scary.
Well, and it's like if it was that effective, I mean, it's hard to, I can only assume that they would have been tempted to take that further.
I'm saying that would follow.
Yeah.
And so, and that's the one that I did know about, and that's with all the preliminary caveat on all that. I mean it's, as I say, that's a scary program, you know, and that should be stopped if whatever use they made of that.
Well, and it's an interesting implication because if one person had that ability, who's to say there isn't other covert operations, you know what, anywhere that could utilize something of that means. So it's an interesting, interesting implication.
No, that's true. That's right. But the fact is, until I told you that, virtually nobody knew about that.
Not that specific one. No,
that's
I
right.
did not.
That's right. So I don't. In the other various kinds of things are dramatically less effective than something like that. You know. So I mean the MK Ultra program and stuff that they tried to do all kinds of stuff with, of giving people acid and, you know, trying to plant subliminal ideas in their mind, all that kind of stuff. You know, and I don't know of any type of mass deployment of the neurolinguistic programming activities. That I know about those things, but I don't know of any specific major program of the agency to try to, you would think they would train some of their operatives to do that, you know, but that's on sort of an individuated basis and mainly in the field, you know.
I have one more question. I have many, but one more for today. Vatican Archives. I have been obsessed with the Library of Alexandria and just the thought of what might be in those archives, as I'm sure you are as well. What do you think, if you were to guess, what do you think they are keeping in there that's related to the disclosure movement right now, and why they're reluctant on releasing that information to you as you requested it?
I don't get paid to guess. If I get retained to find something out, I find it out. Yeah. That's what I do, and it's in the public interest when I get retained to do something, and that's why I confine myself to talking about things that I know about, and I don't speculate.
Do you know of anything that they have in there that?
No, I ask them. As I said, I wrote official letters from the Jesuit headquarters in Washington, D.C., asking the head of the archives if we could have access to the Vatican Library to find out what they did know about ETs and UFOs, and they said no, flat out, and twice.
They didn't give you a reason or anything?
No, just said no. So that one would have to have a reason, and I thought we had a reason then, because President Carter had asked to do the study. I was counsel to the study, and so we had a legitimate jurisdictional reason for wanting to do that. It wasn't just aimless curiosity. And they said no. And I've been in conversations with the people at the Vatican and the head of the library about other matters that I've been involved in. But and I raised that with him, face to face later, and we laughed a bit about it. But I haven't been given permission to see the stuff.
Have they given you any idea that, or reason to believe that they have an intention of possibly releasing anything that's in there anytime soon, or?
Well, it's interesting. Insofar as there has been this specific public statement made by the Vatican after the conference that they had. And they've solicited the laity to participate in this type of conversation about the philosophical and theological implications of contact, or actually only philosophical and theological implications of discovery of life elsewhere. That was their official statement.
Right.
It was my personal conversations with Father Funes where he admitted that they were talking about intelligent life. That's what they're really talking about. And I haven't seen the curriculum of the course down in Argentina, but I should, and I've just been so busy up on this thing in North Dakota with the Lakota people, but that I'm going to follow up on that and see what the reading list looks like, what type of lectures. I've asked that he video the lectures so that we'll have them, and we'll see what their course is, and I don't know. I don't have any specific reason to believe that they would be releasing information from the Vatican library to Father Funes to use as material in his course. I would think they're not at that stage yet to do that. I think his is more of a untutored, kind of intuitively designed course to try to talk about these things in general terms. I think that would have to await a greater demonstration on the part of the laity to be interested in this enough to actually start these conversations. And if we could get those conversations started in a significant way, then I would follow up on that and see, saying, look, I think we're at a stage where we need more information here to further this conversation. And then we'll see how that goes.